The year was 1892, and all of New York was talking about one woman. The newspapers called her America's most beautiful heiress. Her name was Evangeline Ashworth, and she had everything a young woman could want. Money, beauty, a father who owned half the railroads in the country. But what the newspapers did not know was that in just 3 years this same beautiful woman would be locked away in a dark asylum. She would spend her days speaking only of shadows that danced in the halls of her mansion, shadows that no one else could see. Evangeline lived in a world that most people could only dream about. Her father, Cornelius Ashworth, was one of the richest men in America. He had built his fortune by laying railroad tracks from coast to coast. Their mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City was bigger than most hotels. It had 40 rooms and a grand staircase made of pure white marble. Crystal chandeliers hung from every ceiling. The walls were covered with paintings that cost more than most people would earn in their entire lives. Every morning, Evangeline woke up in a bed with silk sheets imported from France. Her breakfast was served on china plates painted with gold. She had more dresses than she could wear in a year. Each one was made by the finest tailors in Paris. When she walked down the street, people would stop and stare. She was that beautiful. But for all her wealth and beauty, Evangeline was not happy. She felt like a bird trapped in a golden cage. Her father controlled every part of her life. He chose her friends. He chose the parties she could attend. He was even trying to choose the man she would marry. Evangeline had been educated in the finest schools in Europe, but she was not allowed to have her own thoughts or dreams. What Evangeline did not know was that her beautiful life was built on something terrible. Her father had not earned his fortune through honest work. He had built his railroads by stealing land from Native American tribes. When the tribes refused to leave their homes, Cornelius had hired men with guns to force them out. Many innocent people had died. Women and children had been killed just so railroad tracks could be built through their sacred lands. The servants in the Ashworth mansion whispered about these things when they thought no one was listening, but Evangeline had sharp ears. She began to hear fragments of their conversations, words like murder and blood money. She heard them talk about burial grounds that had been disturbed, about graves that had been dug up to make room for railroad tracks. At first, Evangeline did not want to believe what she was hearing. How could her kind father be involved in such horrible things? But the more she listened, the more pieces of the truth began to fit together. She started to understand why her father never talked about the early days of his business. She began to realize why he got angry whenever anyone asked him how he had acquired so much land so quickly. In the spring of 1892, Evangeline returned from a year of study in Paris. She expected to go back to her usual life of parties and shopping. But her father had a surprise waiting for her. He had been building a new mansion in the Hudson Valley about 2 hours north of New York City. This was not just any mansion. It was the biggest house anyone had ever built in America. The mansion was called Shadowmere, and it looked like something from a scary fairy tale. It was built in the Gothic style with tall, dark towers and pointed windows. Gargoyles sat on the roof looking down with stone eyes that seemed almost alive. The whole building was made of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even on the brightest summer day, Shadowmere looked cold and forbidding. Cornelius was very proud of his new mansion. He told Evangeline that it would be their summer home, a place where they could escape from the noise and crowds of New York City. But there was something about Shadowmere that made Evangeline feel uncomfortable. The mansion seemed to watch her with its dark windows. It felt like the building itself was alive and waiting for something. What Cornelius had not told his daughter was that Shadowmere was built on very special land. It was not just any piece of property in the Hudson Valley. The land had once been home to a large Native American village. For hundreds of years, families had lived there in peace. They had hunted in the forests and fished in the streams. They had buried their dead in sacred burial grounds that dotted the landscape. When Cornelius decided he wanted this land for his mansion, he did not care about its history. He sent his men to force the Native Americans to leave. When they refused, he used violence. Entire families were killed. Their homes were burned to the ground. Their burial grounds were destroyed to make room for the mansion's foundation. The local people in the Hudson Valley knew about what had happened. They whispered stories about the land being cursed. They said the spirits of the murdered families would never rest. Many of the workers who built Shadowmere reported strange things happening during construction. Tools would disappear. Materials would be found arranged in mysterious patterns. Some workers claimed to hear crying coming from the ground beneath their feet. But Cornelius ignored all these warnings. He paid extra money to keep workers on the job. He threatened anyone who tried to spread stories about the land being cursed. By the summer of 1892, Shadowmere was complete. It stood like a dark monument on the land where so many innocent people had died. When Evangeline first saw Shadowmere, she felt a chill run down her spine. The mansion was beautiful in its own way, but there was something wrong with it. Something that made her skin crawl. The servants who had come from the New York mansion to work at Shadowmere seemed nervous and jumpy. They spoke in whispers and avoided looking directly at the building. On her first night at Shadowmere, Evangeline had trouble sleeping. The mansion was full of strange sounds. Floorboards creaked in empty rooms. Doors seemed to open and close on their own. The wind howled around the towers in a way that sounded almost like human voices crying out in pain. But it was not just sounds that bothered Evangeline. There were smells too. Sometimes she would catch the scent of something burning. It smelled like herbs or grass being burned in a fire. Other times she would smell something sweet and sad like flowers at a funeral. These smells would come and go without warning. They never lasted long enough for her to figure out where they were coming from. The strangest thing of all was the cold. Even though it was summer and the weather was warm, there were places in Shadowmere that felt ice cold. Evangeline would walk into a room and suddenly feel like she had stepped into winter. The cold seemed to come from the walls themselves. No amount of fire in the fireplace could make these cold spots go away. On her very first night at Shadowmere, something happened that would change Evangeline's life forever. She had gone to bed early, feeling tired from the journey from New York City. Her bedroom was on the second floor in the east wing of the mansion. It was a beautiful room with a big four-poster bed and windows that looked out over the forest. Evangeline fell asleep quickly, but she did not sleep peacefully. She had strange dreams about people running through the forest. In her dreams, she could hear screaming and see fires burning in the distance. She dreamed about children crying for their mothers. She dreamed about men with guns chasing families through the trees. Around 3 in the morning, Evangeline woke up suddenly. Something had disturbed her sleep, but she could not figure out what it was. The room was dark and quiet. Everything seemed normal. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she noticed something that made her heart stop beating. Her bedroom door was wide open. She was sure she had closed it and locked it before going to bed, but now it stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow her up. And there on the floor leading from the door to her bed were muddy footprints. They were not her footprints. They were bigger and shaped like the feet of someone who had never worn shoes. Evangeline sat up in bed staring at the footprints in horror. They seemed to glow in the moonlight that came through her windows. She followed them with her eyes from the door across the room to the side of her bed. The last footprint was right next to where she was sleeping, as if someone had stood there watching her while she slept. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out of her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs would not move. All she could do was sit in her bed and stare at those impossible footprints and wonder who or what had been in her room while she slept. When the sun finally rose over Shadowmere Mansion, Evangeline was still sitting in her bed staring at the muddy footprints. She had not moved for hours. She had not slept. She had barely even breathed. The footprints were still there in the morning light. They had not been a dream or a trick of her imagination. Someone or something had been in her room while she slept. Evangeline called for her maid Mary, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. When Mary finally arrived, she gasped at the sight of the muddy tracks across the expensive carpet. But what shocked Mary even more was how Evangeline looked. Her face was white as paper. Her hands were shaking, her beautiful hair was tangled and wild. Mary wanted to clean up the footprints right away, but Evangeline stopped her. She needed to understand what had happened. She studied the prints carefully. They were definitely human footprints, but they were strange. The feet that made them had never worn shoes. The toes were spread wide like someone who had walked barefoot their whole life, and there was something else mixed in with the mud, something that looked like ash from a fire. When Evangeline finally allowed Mary to clean the footprints, the maid worked quickly and nervously. She kept looking over her shoulder as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. After she finished cleaning, Mary whispered to Evangeline that the other servants had heard strange noises during the night. doors slamming, footsteps in empty hallways, the sound of someone crying. Over the next few days, Evangeline began to pay more attention to what the servants were saying. She noticed that they always traveled in pairs. No one would go anywhere in the mansion alone, especially after dark. They spoke in hushed voices and stopped talking whenever she entered a room. When she asked them directly about the strange occurrences, they would only shake their heads and claim they had not noticed anything unusual. But Evangeline was not stupid. She could see the fear in their eyes. She could hear them whispering when they thought she was not around. Words like cursed land and angry spirits. They talked about the Native American families who had lived on the land before the mansion was built. They spoke of murder and revenge. One night, Evangeline decided to hide in the servants' quarters and listen to their conversations. What she heard made her blood run cold. The cook, Mrs. Henderson, was telling the other servants about the construction of Shadowmere. She said the workers had found bones in the ground, human bones, children's bones, but Cornelius had ordered them to keep digging anyway. He had told them to throw the bones away like garbage. Mrs. Henderson also talked about the strange accidents that had happened during construction. 3 workers had died in accidents that made no sense. Tools had flown through the air and struck men in the head. Scaffolding had collapsed for no reason. One worker had claimed that invisible hands pushed him off a ladder. After he told this story, he was found dead the next morning with no explanation for how he died. As summer turned to autumn, the strange occurrences at Shadowmere became more frequent and more frightening. It was no longer just muddy footprints and strange smells. The mansion itself seemed to come alive after dark. Doors would slam shut with such force that the whole building would shake. But when someone went to investigate, the doors would be standing wide open as if nothing had happened. The grand piano in the music room began playing by itself. Always the same sad melody that sounded like a funeral song. When Evangeline went to look at the piano, the keys would be moving up and down, but there was no one sitting at the bench. The music would stop the moment she entered the room, but she could still hear the echo of the sad notes hanging in the air. Evangeline started seeing things that could not be explained. Shadows that moved when there was nothing to cast them. Dark shapes that would dart across doorways just at the edge of her vision. When she turned to look directly at them, there would be nothing there. But she could feel eyes watching her from every corner of every room. The portraits that hung on the walls seemed to come alive at night. Their eyes would follow Evangeline as she walked through the hallways. Sometimes she would see their lips moving as if they were trying to say something important. But no sound ever came from the painted mouths. The portraits looked sad and angry at the same time, like they were trying to warn her about something terrible. One rainy afternoon in October, Evangeline was exploring the library when she made a discovery that would change her life forever. She was looking for a book to read when she noticed that one section of the bookshelf looked different from the rest. The wood was a slightly different color, and there seemed to be a gap behind some of the books. When Evangeline pulled on the books, the entire section of the shelf swung inward like a door. Behind it was a hidden room that she had never seen before. The room was small and dark and filled with the smell of old papers and something else. Something that smelled like death. The hidden room was her father's secret study. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and shelves full of documents. On the desk were photographs that made Evangeline sick to look at. Pictures of Native American villages being burned. Images of families running in terror. Photos of children's bodies lying in the dirt. But the photographs were not the worst thing in the room. On one wall hung a display case filled with things that had been taken from the murdered families. Scalps of hair, jewelry made from beads and feathers, a small pair of children's moccasins that were stained with what looked like blood. These were trophies that her father had kept to remember his victims. In the filing cabinets, Evangeline found documents that told the complete story of how her father had built his fortune. Letters to government officials asking for help in removing the Native Americans from their land. Reports from the men he had hired to do the killing. Records showing exactly how many people had died so that railroad tracks could be built through their homes. As Evangeline read through document after document, she began to understand the full horror of what her father had done. The Ashworth fortune was not built on hard work and smart business decisions. It was built on the blood of innocent people. Every dollar her family had spent, every luxury she had enjoyed, every beautiful dress she had worn, All of it had been paid for with the lives of murdered families. The documents showed that her father had not just stolen land from Native Americans. He had ordered the complete destruction of entire communities. Men, women, and children had been killed just because they lived on land that Cornelius wanted for his railroads. The burial grounds where these people had laid their ancestors to rest had been dug up and destroyed. Sacred objects had been stolen and kept as souvenirs. Evangeline found records showing that the land where Shadowmere now stood had once been home to over 200 people. Families had lived there for generations. Children had played in the streams that now flowed through her father's gardens. But in the winter of 1885, all of these people had been killed in a single night. Their village had been burned to the ground, and their bodies had been thrown into mass graves. The worst part was reading about the children. Dozens of children had been living on the land when her father decided he wanted it. The documents showed that these children had been killed just like the adults. Their small bodies had been buried in shallow graves all around the area where Shadowmere now stood. Some of the graves were right underneath the mansion itself. As Evangeline sat in the hidden room reading about the terrible crimes her family had committed, she began to understand what was happening at Shadowmere. The strange occurrences were not random haunting. They were the spirits of the murdered families trying to get justice. The footprints in her bedroom had belonged to one of the victims. The sad piano music was a funeral song for the dead children. The spirits were not trying to hurt Evangeline. They were trying to tell her the truth about what had happened on their land. They wanted someone from the Ashworth family to acknowledge the crimes that had been committed. They wanted their story to be told. They wanted justice for the innocent people who had died. But Evangeline also realized that the spirits were growing stronger. What had started as simple footprints and piano music was becoming more powerful. The mansion was becoming a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was breaking down, and she was trapped right in the middle of it. As she sat surrounded by the evidence of her father's crimes, Evangeline heard a sound that made her heart stop. Footsteps were coming down the hallway toward the library. Heavy footsteps that sounded like boots made of stone, and with the footsteps came the smell of smoke and death. Something was coming for her, and there was nowhere to run. The heavy footsteps continued down the hallway toward the library where Evangeline sat frozen with fear. Each step sounded like boots made of stone hitting the marble floor. But these were not the footsteps of any living person. They moved too slowly and too deliberately. Between each step there was a pause, as if whoever was walking was dragging something heavy behind them. Evangeline quickly shoved the horrible documents back into the filing cabinet and pushed the secret door closed. She grabbed a random book from the shelf and pretended to be reading when the footsteps reached the library entrance. But when she looked up, no one was there. The doorway was empty, yet she could still hear breathing. Slow, raspy breathing like someone who had dirt in their lungs. The smell that came with the footsteps was worse than anything Evangeline had ever experienced. It smelled like a graveyard mixed with smoke from burning wood. It smelled like death and sorrow and rage all combined into one terrible odor that made her stomach turn. The smell filled the entire library and seemed to seep into her clothes and hair. For several minutes, Evangeline sat perfectly still, waiting for something to happen. The breathing continued, but she could see nothing. Then slowly the sound began to fade away. The footsteps started again, moving away from the library and disappearing into the depths of the mansion. But the smell lingered for hours afterward, like a warning that something terrible was coming. That night, Evangeline could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the photographs from her father's secret room. Images of murdered children and burning villages filled her dreams. She decided to get up and walk around the mansion, hoping that movement would help calm her mind. This was the biggest mistake she could have made. As soon as Evangeline left her bedroom, she realized that Shadowmere had become a completely different place after dark. The hallways that seemed merely cold and unwelcoming during the day had transformed into something from a nightmare. Shadows moved along the walls without anything to cast them. The air itself seemed thick and hard to breathe, like she was walking underwater. When Evangeline reached the grand staircase, she saw something that made her legs give out beneath her. At the bottom of the stairs stood a woman unlike anyone she had ever seen. The woman was tall and thin, with long black hair that seemed to float around her face. Her skin had a strange glow like moonlight on water. She wore clothing made of animal hide and beads that clicked softly when she moved. But it was the woman's eyes that frightened Evangeline the most. They were completely black with no white showing at all, and they were filled with a sadness so deep that just looking into them made Evangeline want to cry. The woman stared up at Evangeline for what felt like hours. Then she raised one hand and pointed directly at her. When the woman opened her mouth to speak, no sound came out, but somehow Evangeline could hear her voice inside her own head. The voice spoke in a language Evangeline did not understand, but the meaning was clear. This woman was angry. She was in pain, and she blamed the Ashworth family for her suffering. Suddenly, the grand staircase in the entrance hall of Shadowmere disappeared. Evangeline found herself standing in a forest clearing under a starry sky. But she was not alone. All around her were the people who had lived on this land before her father destroyed their lives. Families sat around campfires talking quietly. Children played games in the grass. Old people told stories to groups of listeners. Evangeline could see everything as clearly as if she was really there. She could smell the smoke from the cooking fires. She could hear the laughter of the children and the soft voices of their parents. This was what the land had been like before Shadowmere was built. It had been a place of peace and happiness, where people lived in harmony with nature. But then the vision changed, and Evangeline saw the night when her father's men came. She watched in horror as armed men on horses rode into the peaceful village. She saw families running in terror, trying to protect their children. She heard screaming and gunshots and the sound of wooden homes being set on fire. The worst part was seeing the children. Evangeline watched as little boys and girls who had been playing happily just moments before were killed by men with guns. She saw mothers trying to shield their babies and fathers fighting desperately to protect their families. But there were too many attackers and they were too well armed. One by one, every person in the village was murdered. When the killing was over, Evangeline saw her father himself riding into the village. Cornelius Ashworth looked younger, but his face was just as cold and cruel as it was now. He walked among the bodies, making sure that everyone was dead. When he found the sacred burial ground where the village had laid their ancestors to rest, he ordered his men to dig up the graves and scatter the bones. When the vision ended, Evangeline was back in Shadowmere staring at the mysterious woman on the staircase. This time when the woman spoke, Evangeline could understand every word. The woman's name was Ayana, and she had been the spiritual leader of the village that once stood where the mansion now sat. Ayana told Evangeline that she and all the other people who had been murdered were trapped on this land. They could not move on to the spirit world because their deaths had been so violent and unjust. They could not rest because their sacred burial ground had been destroyed and their ancestors' bones had been scattered like garbage. For 7 years, the spirits had been trying to get someone to listen to their story. They had tried to communicate with the workers who built Shadowmere, but the men had been too frightened to pay attention. They had tried to reach Cornelius, but his heart was too hard and cruel to hear their voices. Evangeline was their last hope. She was the only member of the Ashworth family who had any kindness left in her soul. Ayana explained that the strange events at Shadowmere would continue to get stronger until justice was done. The spirits would not stop haunting the mansion until the truth about the murders was told to the world. They wanted Cornelius to confess his crimes and face punishment for what he had done. They wanted the sacred burial ground to be restored and their ancestors' bones to be properly buried again. After her encounter with Ayana, the supernatural activity at Shadowmere became much more intense and much more frightening. It was no longer just sounds and smells and glimpses of shadows. The spirits began to manifest physically in ways that could not be ignored or explained away. Evangeline would wake up in the morning to find handprints burned into her bedroom walls. The prints were too big to be human and they glowed with a strange blue light that hurt to look at. Sometimes she would find objects in her room that had not been there the night before. Pieces of pottery painted with Native American designs, feathers tied with leather cord, small bones arranged in patterns that looked like some kind of message. The mirrors in Shadowmere began showing things that were not really there. When Evangeline looked at her reflection, she would sometimes see other faces looking back at her. The faces of the murdered villagers, men and women and children, all staring at her with pleading eyes. Their mouths would move as if they were trying to tell her something important, but she could never hear what they were saying. Furniture began moving by itself during the day when Evangeline was watching. Heavy chairs would slide across rooms with no one touching them. Tables would flip over, spilling everything onto the floor. The grand piano in the music room would play the same sad funeral song over and over again, even when the lid was closed and locked. Most terrifying of all were the times when Evangeline would feel invisible hands touching her. Cold fingers would grab her arms or pull her hair. Sometimes she would wake up with bruises on her skin in the shape of handprints. The bruises were always ice-cold to the touch, and they would not heal no matter what medicine she put on them. The supernatural activity became so intense that even Cornelius and the other family members could no longer pretend nothing was happening. Evangeline's younger brother Thomas started having nightmares every night. He would wake up screaming about dead children calling to him from the forest. During the day, he would walk in his sleep toward the areas where the mass graves were hidden. The servants were quitting faster than they could be replaced. Even the promise of extra money could not convince them to stay at Shadowmere after they witnessed the paranormal events. The cook, Mrs. Henderson, left after she saw pots and pans flying around the kitchen by themselves. The butler quit when he found muddy footprints leading through every room of the mansion, with no explanation for how they got there. Cornelius tried to ignore what was happening, but even he could not explain away some of the things he witnessed. One morning, he found his study completely destroyed. Every piece of furniture had been overturned. His papers were scattered everywhere, and written on the wall in what looked like blood were symbols that no one could read. When guests came to visit Shadowmere, they would leave early claiming they felt sick or uncomfortable. Some reported seeing figures walking through the halls at night. Others said they heard crying coming from the walls themselves. Word began to spread among New York's high society that there was something wrong with the Ashworth mansion. As the haunting intensified, Evangeline realized that she was the only one who could stop it. The spirits had chosen to communicate with her because she was the only member of her family who was capable of feeling guilt and remorse. She was the only one who could understand that what her father had done was wrong, and that the murdered families deserved justice. Evangeline decided that she had to confront her father with the evidence she had found in his secret room. She had to force him to admit what he had done and make him take responsibility for his crimes. It was the only way to give the spirits the acknowledgement they were seeking. But she also knew that confronting Cornelius would be dangerous. Her father was a powerful man who had killed to protect his secrets before. If he realized that Evangeline knew the truth about how he built his fortune, there was no telling what he might do to keep her quiet. As Evangeline prepared for the confrontation that would change everything, she heard Ayana's voice one more time. The spirit woman appeared to her in the library and delivered a warning that made Evangeline's blood run cold. The spirits were growing stronger every day. Soon they would have enough power to take their revenge on the entire Ashworth family. If justice was not done soon, everyone who carried the Ashworth name would suffer the same fate as the villagers who had been murdered 7 years ago. Evangeline waited until the next morning to confront her father. She gathered all the documents and photographs from his secret room and spread them across his desk in his main study. When Cornelius walked in and saw what his daughter had found, his face turned white with rage. His hands began to shake and his eyes filled with a fury that Evangeline had never seen before. Cornelius did not try to deny what the documents showed. Instead, he became angry that Evangeline had dared to go through his private papers. He told her that everything he had done was necessary for business. The Native Americans had been standing in the way of progress and civilization. They had to be removed so that the railroad could be built and America could grow strong. When Evangeline asked him about the children who had been killed, Cornelius showed no emotion at all. He said that the children would have grown up to be savages just like their parents. It was better that they died young before they could cause more trouble. His words were so cold and cruel that Evangeline felt like she was talking to a stranger instead of her own father. Evangeline begged her father to confess his crimes publicly and make amends for what he had done. She told him about the spirits that were haunting Shadowmere and how they would not rest until justice was served. But Cornelius only laughed at her. He said she was being hysterical and letting her feminine imagination run wild. There were no such things as ghosts and spirits. The confrontation ended badly when Cornelius threatened to have Evangeline committed to an asylum if she ever spoke about these matters again. He said that no one would believe the wild stories of a mentally unstable woman. He gathered up all the documents and photographs and told her he was going to burn them. Without evidence, no one would ever know what had really happened on the land where Shadowmere was built. After the confrontation with her father, Evangeline's life changed completely. Cornelius began telling people that his daughter was suffering from nervous exhaustion and female hysteria. He said that the stress of managing such a large household had been too much for her delicate constitution. He hired doctors who agreed with his diagnosis without even examining Evangeline properly. Word spread quickly through New York's high society that Evangeline Ashworth was having mental problems. The newspapers that had once called her America's most beautiful heiress now wrote articles about her strange behavior and unstable moods. Society ladies who had been her friends stopped inviting her to parties and social events. Most devastating of all was what happened with her engagement. Lord Pemberton had been courting Evangeline for over a year, and everyone expected them to announce their wedding soon. But when he heard the rumors about her mental state, he broke off their relationship immediately. He did it publicly at a dinner party in front of 50 guests. He stood up and announced that he could not marry a woman who was clearly insane. The humiliation was more than Evangeline could bear. She had lost her father's love. She had lost her friends and her place in society. She had lost the man she thought she was going to marry. Everyone believed she was crazy, and no one would listen when she tried to tell them the truth about what was happening at Shadowmere. But the worst part was that the supernatural activity was getting stronger every day. The spirits seemed to feed on Evangeline's emotional pain and isolation. The more alone and desperate she became, the more powerful the haunting grew. As winter approached, the paranormal events at Shadowmere became more violent and more terrifying than ever before. The spirits were no longer content to just show themselves to Evangeline. They began to take control of her body and mind in ways that left her feeling helpless and afraid. Sometimes Evangeline would black out for hours at a time. When she came back to consciousness, she would find herself in strange places with no memory of how she got there. Once she woke up in the forest behind the mansion, wearing only her nightgown in the freezing cold. Her feet were cut and bleeding from walking barefoot over rocks and thorns. Another time she found herself in the basement of Shadowmere, digging in the dirt floor with her bare hands. During these blackout episodes, Evangeline would speak in languages she had never learned. The servants reported hearing her talking in what sounded like Native American words. Her voice would change completely, becoming deeper and more commanding than her normal speaking voice. Sometimes she would speak as if she was multiple people having conversations with each other. The physical changes in Evangeline were frightening to see. Her beautiful blonde hair began falling out in large clumps. Her skin became pale and thin like paper. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and her lips turned blue as if she was always cold. She lost so much weight that her clothes hung loose on her thin frame. Most disturbing of all were Evangeline's eyes. They began to change color from their normal blue to a strange black that seemed to reflect no light at all. When people looked into her eyes, they said they felt like they were looking into an empty grave. Some servants claimed they could see other faces looking back at them from behind Evangeline's eyes. The spirits began showing Evangeline visions that were more real and more horrible than anything she had experienced before. She would suddenly find herself living through the night when the village was destroyed. But instead of watching from a distance like before, she was experiencing everything through the eyes of the victims. Evangeline lived through the terror of a mother trying to protect her baby from armed men. She felt the pain of being shot and the agony of watching her children die. She experienced the fear of a young girl hiding in the forest while her family was murdered. She felt what it was like to have her home burned down and her sacred objects stolen. These visions were so real that Evangeline's body would show physical signs of what she was experiencing. After a vision of being shot, she would have bruises and pain in the exact spot where the bullet had hit the original victim. After experiencing a burning building, she would smell like smoke for days. When she lived through someone drowning in the river, her lungs would fill with water and she would nearly suffocate. The visions came at random times during the day and night. Evangeline never knew when she would suddenly be transported back to that terrible night in 1885. She could be eating dinner and suddenly find herself running through the forest in terror. She could be reading a book and suddenly experience being stabbed with a knife. These experiences were destroying Evangeline's mind. She began to lose track of what was real and what was a vision from the past. Sometimes she would wake up thinking she was one of the murdered villagers instead of herself. She would speak to people who were not there and react to dangers that no longer existed. During one of her conversations with Ayana, the spirit woman revealed something that made Evangeline's blood turn to ice. The spirits were not just trying to get acknowledgement for their deaths. They were planning to take revenge on the entire Ashworth family. Every person who carried the Ashworth name would pay for Cornelius's crimes. Ayanna explained that the spirits had been gathering power for 7 years. Soon they would be strong enough to kill every member of the Ashworth family in the same way that their own families had been killed. Thomas would be the first to die because he was the youngest and most innocent. Then they would kill Cornelius's wife and his other children. Cornelius himself would be saved for last, so he could watch his entire family suffer before he died. The spirits had chosen Evangeline to deliver this message because they wanted her to understand what was going to happen. They were giving her one last chance to convince her father to confess his crimes and make amends. If Cornelius would publicly admit what he had done and restore the sacred burial ground, the spirits might be willing to spare the family's lives. But Ayanna also warned Evangeline that time was running out. The spirits were growing stronger every day, and their anger was becoming harder to control. Some of them no longer wanted justice. They only wanted revenge. If something was not done soon, the supernatural forces would become too powerful for even Ayanna to stop. Evangeline realized that she was trapped between two impossible choices. She could try one more time to convince her father to confess his crimes, but she knew he would never agree to destroy his reputation and his business empire, or she could accept that her entire family was going to die in a supernatural revenge that she was powerless to stop. As Evangeline struggled with this terrible decision, the haunting at Shadowmere reached new levels of intensity. Objects flew through the air with deadly force, windows shattered for no reason. The temperature in the mansion dropped so low that water froze in the pipes even though it was being heated by large furnaces. The servants who remained at Shadowmere reported seeing armies of spirits walking through the halls. Not just Ayanna and a few others, but hundreds of ghostly figures. Men and women and children all moving through the mansion like soldiers preparing for battle. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and their faces were filled with a rage that had been building for 7 years. Evangeline knew that she was running out of time. The spirits were preparing for their final assault on the Ashworth family. Soon the supernatural forces would be unleashed and nothing would be able to stop them. She had to make a choice about what she was going to do, but every option seemed to lead to death and destruction. As she sat alone in her room listening to the sounds of the spirit army gathering in the halls below, Evangeline made a decision that would change everything. She decided that there was only one way to stop the supernatural revenge and save her family from the fate that awaited them. She would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. She would have to give her own life to appease the angry spirits and end the curse that was destroying everyone she loved. On a cold December night in 1894, Evangeline knew that her time had come. The spirits had been gathering their power for months, and now they were ready to unleash their final revenge on the Ashworth family. The air in Shadowmere was thick with supernatural energy that made it hard to breathe. Every surface in the mansion was covered with frost, even though fires were burning in every fireplace. Evangeline could hear the spirit army moving through the halls. Hundreds of ghostly footsteps echoed through the building like thunder. The voices of the dead filled every room, speaking in their native language and calling for justice. The very walls of Shadowmere seemed to shake with their anger and their pain. Ayanna appeared to Evangeline one final time in her bedroom. The spirit woman looked more solid and more real than she ever had before. Her black eyes burned with supernatural fire, and her voice carried the power of all the murdered souls who stood behind her. She told Evangeline that the time for talking was over. The spirits had waited 7 years for justice, and they would wait no longer. The plan was simple and terrible. The spirits would kill every member of the Ashworth family in the same way that their own families had been murdered. They would use their supernatural powers to recreate the massacre that had destroyed their village. Blood would pay for blood, and death would pay for death. But Ayanna also offered Evangeline one final choice. If she was willing to sacrifice her own life to pay for her father's crimes, the spirits might be satisfied with her death alone. They would spare the rest of the family if Evangeline would take responsibility for the murders and accept the punishment that her father deserved. As midnight approached, the supernatural manifestations at Shadowmere reached levels that defied all understanding. The mansion filled with the spirits of every person who had been killed when the village was destroyed. Men and women and children materialized in every room. Their ghostly forms glowed with an eerie blue light that cast strange shadows on the walls. The spirits were not the peaceful people they had been in life. 7 years of anger and pain had transformed them into something frightening and dangerous. Their faces were twisted with rage, and their eyes burned with the need for revenge. They moved through the mansion like an army preparing for battle. Some carried the ghostly images of the weapons that had been used to kill them. Others had their hands shaped like claws ready to tear apart their enemies. The temperature in Shadowmere dropped to below freezing. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and the breath of anyone still alive came out in visible clouds. The supernatural cold was so intense that it seemed to freeze the very air itself. Even the fires in the fireplaces could not provide any warmth against the chill of the grave. The spirits began to make sounds that had never been heard by living ears. They howled like wind through a cemetery. They screamed like souls in torment. They chanted in their native language, calling on their ancestors to witness the revenge they were about to take. The noise was so loud and so horrible that several of the remaining servants ran from the mansion and never returned. Evangeline could feel the supernatural energy building like a storm about to break. The spirits were drawing power from the pain and suffering that had happened on this land. Soon they would have enough strength to kill everyone in the mansion, and nothing would be able to stop them. Evangeline made her way to her father's secret room where this nightmare had all begun. She gathered the sacred objects that Cornelius had stolen from the murdered families, the scalps and jewelry and children's moccasins that had been kept as trophies. She also took a bottle of poison that she had been saving for this moment, a poison that would kill her quickly and end her suffering. As Evangeline prepared to make her sacrifice, she thought about her life and all the things she would never experience. She would never get married or have children. She would never travel the world or fall in love. She would never grow old or see what the future would bring. But she also knew that her death might save her family and give peace to the spirits who had suffered for so long. The spirits gathered around Evangeline as she sat in the secret room holding the poison. They watched her with their burning eyes and waited to see what choice she would make. Some of them looked angry and impatient. Others seemed sad, as if they understood the sacrifice she was about to make. A few of the child spirits looked at her with something that might have been pity. Ayana spoke to Evangeline one last time. She explained that if Evangeline chose to die, the spirits would accept her sacrifice and leave the Ashworth family alone. But there would be a price beyond just her death. Evangeline's spirit would be bound to this land forever. She would become a guardian of the burial ground and a protector of the dead. She would never be able to move on to whatever came after death. Evangeline accepted these terms without hesitation. She would rather spend eternity protecting the spirits than live knowing that her family would be destroyed because of her father's crimes. She raised the bottle of poison to her lips and prepared to drink it, but before she could swallow the deadly liquid, something unexpected happened. The moment Evangeline made her decision to become the eternal guardian, the spirits of Shadowmere began the ritual that would transform her forever. The ghostly figures formed a circle around her and began chanting in their native language. Their voices grew louder and more powerful until the very walls of the mansion shook with supernatural force. Evangeline felt the change beginning deep inside her body. It started as a cold sensation that spread from her heart to every part of her being. Her human warmth was being replaced by something else, something that belonged to both the world of the living and the world of the dead. She could feel her mortal life slipping away, but she was not dying. She was becoming something entirely new. The transformation was painful, but also beautiful in a way that no living person could understand. Evangeline could suddenly see and hear things that had been hidden from her before. She could perceive the spirits of all the people who had ever died on this land going back hundreds of years. She could feel their emotions and understand their desires for justice and peace. As the ritual continued, Evangeline's appearance began to change. Her hair turned from blonde to black and began to flow around her like it was underwater. Her blue eyes became dark as night but filled with a strange inner light. Her skin took on the same pale glow that marked all the spirits. She was no longer fully human, but she was not dead either. When the transformation was complete, Evangeline found that she had gained powers she had never imagined. She could move through walls like they were made of air. She could appear and disappear at will. She could communicate with any spirit no matter what language they spoke in life. Most importantly, she could control the supernatural forces that had been threatening to destroy everything. The first thing Evangeline did with her new powers was to stop the supernatural curse from spreading beyond Shadowmere. She called back all the angry spirits and contained their revenge within the boundaries of the mansion and its grounds. The attacks on Ashworth properties across the country stopped immediately. The innocent people who had been caught up in the supernatural plague were safe. But Evangeline could not undo all the damage that had already been done. Cornelius had been driven mad by his encounters with the spirits. He spent his remaining days locked in his study, talking to people who were not there and reliving the murders he had committed. His business empire crumbled as investors lost confidence and workers refused to return to properties that had been touched by supernatural activity. The other members of the Ashworth family were forever changed by their experiences with the curse. Thomas never recovered from the nightmares and visions that had plagued him. He spent the rest of his life in and out of mental institutions claiming that he could still hear the voices of dead children calling to him. The family's reputation was destroyed, and their fortune gradually disappeared. Evangeline watched all of this happen, but she could not interfere. Her role as guardian meant that she had to maintain the balance between justice and mercy. The Ashworth family had to face some consequences for the crimes that had built their wealth. But she made sure that the punishment fit the crime, and that innocent people were not harmed. The mansion itself became uninhabitable for living people. The supernatural energy that filled Shadowmere was too intense for mortal minds to handle. The family abandoned the estate and it stood empty for decades. Local people avoided the area, claiming that strange lights and sounds could be seen and heard coming from the empty building. As the years passed, Evangeline learned to accept her new existence as guardian of Shadowmere. She discovered that her role involved much more than just controlling angry spirits. She became a protector of all the souls who had died unjustly on this land. She helped lost spirits find peace and guided them to whatever came after death. Evangeline also became a witness to history. She watched as the truth about what happened to Native American communities gradually came to light. She saw historians and researchers begin to uncover evidence of the massacres and injustices that had been hidden for so long. She witnessed the slow process of acknowledgement and reconciliation that began in the 20th century. Sometimes living people would come to Shadowmere seeking answers about their family histories or trying to understand what had happened on the land. Evangeline would appear to them in dreams or visions and share what she knew. She helped genealogists trace the descendants of the murdered villagers. She guided researchers to hidden documents and unmarked graves. But Evangeline's existence was also lonely and difficult. She was trapped between two worlds and belonged fully to neither. She could interact with spirits, but she missed the warmth and companionship of living people. She could appear to the living, but they were usually frightened of her and could not understand what she had become. The child spirits who had died in the massacre became Evangeline's closest companions. They were the most innocent victims of her father's crimes, and she felt a special responsibility to care for them. She created a peaceful space within Shadowmere where the children could play and be happy. She told them stories and sang them songs to help them forget their traumatic deaths. In the 1970s, something changed that gave Evangeline new hope. Historians and activists began to seriously study the injustices committed against Native American peoples during the expansion of the United States. The truth about massacres like the one that had happened at Shadowmere started to become public knowledge. Evangeline watched as descendants of the original tribes returned to the land where their ancestors had lived and died. They came to honor the memory of their families and to perform proper burial ceremonies for the victims. For the first time in over 80 years, the spirits felt that their deaths were being acknowledged, and their suffering was being recognized. The government eventually designated Shadowmere as a historical site. Plaques were installed that told the true story of what had happened to the Native American village. The mass graves were properly marked and protected. Sacred ceremonies were performed to bless the land and honor the dead. These changes brought great peace to many of the spirits that Evangeline had been guarding. With their deaths properly acknowledged and their memory honored, they were finally able to move on to whatever came after life. One by one, the angry and restless souls found peace and left Shadowmere for the spirit world. But Evangeline remained. Even as the other spirits moved on, she stayed to continue her role as guardian. She had made a commitment to protect this land, and all who had died on it. That commitment was eternal and could not be broken even when her task became easier. In the year 2023, something happened that Evangeline had been waiting for over a century. The last living descendant of Cornelius Ashworth came to Shadowmere. This was a young woman named Sarah who had spent years researching her family history and learning about the crimes her ancestor had committed. Sarah came to Shadowmere accompanied by a Native American spiritual advisor named Joseph. He was a descendant of one of the families that had been murdered in 1885. Together, they had come to perform a ceremony that would finally bring complete closure to the events that had begun so long ago. Evangeline appeared to both Sarah and Joseph during their visit. For the first time in over 100 years, she was able to have a real conversation with living people who understood what she had become and why. Sarah acknowledged her family's guilt and asked for forgiveness. Joseph performed traditional ceremonies to honor the dead and bless the land. The ceremony was beautiful and powerful. Joseph sang traditional songs and burned sacred herbs. Sarah read the names of all the people who had been killed in the massacre and asked their spirits to find peace. Together, they created a new monument that would ensure the truth would never be forgotten. When the ceremony was complete, Evangeline felt a change in herself that she had not experienced since her transformation. For the first time in over a century, she was offered a choice. The spirits of the murdered villagers appeared one final time and told her that her duties as guardian were complete. She could finally move on to the spirit world, if she chose to. Evangeline stood at the crossroads between her eternal duty and the peace of final rest. She could feel the pull of the spirit world calling to her. After more than 100 years of loneliness and responsibility, she could finally be free. She could join Ayana and the other spirits who had moved on to whatever came after death. But as Evangeline considered this choice, she realized that her work was not truly finished. There were other places where injustices had been committed and spirits still waited for acknowledgement. There were other families who needed to learn the truth about their history. There were other wrongs that needed to be made right. Evangeline also thought about the children who had become her companions over the years. Most of them had found peace and moved on, but a few remained. They were the youngest victims who were still afraid and confused about what had happened to them. They needed someone to care for them and help them understand that they were safe now. After much consideration, Evangeline made her final choice. She decided to remain as guardian, not just of Shadowmere, but of all the places where similar injustices had occurred. She would continue to help lost spirits find peace and assist living people in learning the truth about their history, but her role would be different now. Instead of being trapped by anger and the need for revenge, she would be motivated by love and the desire to heal old wounds. She would work to bring together the descendants of both victims and perpetrators so they could find understanding and forgiveness.